Been a busy past month, and not only did we have all of that took place, but there were many conversations and transformations that are in process that have been taking place, and it has been a really great ride. Additionally, last Sunday we took the time to pause and give you a chance to think about how it is that maybe you would engage in child sponsorship as a way of expressing the generosity that God has given to you and allowing that to extend out to others. And as of this morning, we had 13 children that have been picked up so far. So give God a hand for that, guys. That's really exciting stuff right there. If you weren't with us last week and you would like to consider being a child sponsor, then we still have a few more names that are here. I actually have a few of them here with me. I have a Maria, and she is from Colombia, and so she's looking for child sponsorship. And Isaac, and from Tanzania, and then a couple of other boys and girls, Rachel, and another Isaac, Anita, and that's who I have here with me. And these are children who are, not privileged to the same access of healthcare or education or spiritual nourishment that you and I are. Some of these children that I just named off for you are children who are with Horizon International, and their parents have either died or disappeared due to HIV/AIDS. Some are children who are associated with Church of God congregations around the globe. And so if you didn't get a chance to be a part of that and you would like to be a part of that, then just see me after the service or see Lori, our administrative assistant, and in the office down the hall here. We'll be glad to give you the opportunity to consider how it is that you can be a part of child sponsorship. I've been talking a little bit about, actually not a little bit, a lot, about money the past few weeks, and it's always an uncomfortable subject. If you are visiting church for the first time in a long time, then here it is. We did it. We talked about money. All your assumptions were true. All church ever talks about is money. It's not all we talk about, but it is a big part of our lives. I mean, think about it for just a moment. Where can you do anything or go about anything without worrying about money? And I've got some people standing up in the back who are telling me I forgot something. And so I'm going to take care of this real quick. All right, Cuddle Caboose. All of our kids for Cuddle Caboose, you guys are released. That's kindergarten, first graders, and below. You guys are released on out to Cuddle Caboose. Sorry about that. I totally forgot. Even though we had this big, long conversation about it before church. That's the way it goes. I was just excited to get up here and get going. But talking about money, and think about this for just a moment. All right, where can you go and not spend money? All right. And how did you get there and not spend money?
You rode a bike.
Okay. Let's think about this. What is it that you are going to eat in the next 3 days that you didn't spend money on? What are you going to eat in the next 3 days that you didn't spend money on? And some of you are like, well, I didn't buy anything. Okay, for those of you who didn't buy anything because you're under the age of buying, right? What is it that you're eating that your parents didn't buy and that no one else bought for you? You may have a tomato garden. You may have a strawberry plant that's producing for you. You may possibly have, some other leafy vegetables, that Aaron provided to you from his spinach garden, or something of that nature. But odds are, where you go, how you go, what you eat, and even where you eat involve money. And that basic level of things, I mean, we live in a culture and a society where money is all around, and the problem with talking about money in the church is that we always talk about it from the standpoint of give your money to the church. And I'm not going to lie, it's really hard for me to get up here and talk about money because, well, part of the money that is given to the church makes it possible for me to have an office space. Part of the money that comes to, through you guys that's given to the church goes to help make sure that I have food on my table and that I've got clothes to wear for myself and clothes for my kids and all these other different dynamics. And so there's a part in which when pastors talk about money, the reason that it's sticky and the reason that it's awkward is because at some level it's about them, or at least that's the way people perceive it. And that makes it really awkward because it's like, well, if we get more money, we can have more of this. And if we get more money, then I can get a bigger paycheck. And all those different dynamics that oftentimes have been associated with this conversation about money and the church. And so when we talk about tithing in the church, it's like, well, just put more money in the offering plate so that way we can have a better building or a bigger building, or we can have, more staff or at least better paid staff, and all these different dynamics. And it is extremely awkward. And then there are days when we talk about it that we kind of go, is that what the Bible's talking about when it talks about tithing, when it talks about giving? Because when we look around in the world that we're in, we go, oh my goodness, there's so many needs, there's so many poor people in our culture, and why are we giving all the money to the church so they can build $1 million building, and when we could, easily just turn around and give that money to the poor and they would have homes, or they wouldn't go hungry, or they'd have medical care, or any number of different things. And let me just tell you, it is not a simple subject. It is extremely complex. It is extremely nuanced, and it is extremely personal when we talk about money. Because how we use our money is an expression of what we value. It's an expression of what we believe. How we put our money to use and what we spend our money on is a mirror in many aspects. I mean, think about it for just a moment. When you look in the mirror, you may see you're a little, like me, a little pudgier in the regions that you don't want to be pudgy in. And then you go look at your transactions and you realize that you ate out a bunch. And it's kind of like, why am I so overweight? What have I been eating? How often did I have Starbucks? I don't do Starbucks, so I can use that one. All right? Right? But, how we use our money is a reflection of who we are. And that is why when churches talk about money, it gets extremely difficult. Because of the many things we can talk about, it's the one thing that tends to hit all of us. I mean, after all, not all of us have murdered someone, at least physically. Not all of us have committed adultery, at least physically. Not all of us have, well, I take it back. Probably most of us have dishonored our parents. Not all of us lie all the time. But this dynamic of money, we all see it. We all have it pass through our hands, and we all, well, let's just be honest. We'd all like a little bit more of it. Right? I mean, how many of you would like a little bit more money? I just wanted to give you an opportunity to tell the truth or continue to lie. That's okay. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because this is what frustrates me about money. Is no matter how much I have, I always could use more. It's not that I need more, I could use more. I could put it to use in other ways and doing different things with it in different ways. And, whether that's me giving it away, or maybe it's me, eating something, or me buying the latest tech gadget. I mean, this week I had to break down and buy a new iPhone because I couldn't trust the battery in my old one. It's like, I'd be 50%, started at 100%, I'd be at 50% in an hour, and it was just got to be really problematic when I was traveling around. I had to have a cable with me everywhere I went. And I thought the whole point behind being wireless was that I didn't have to have the cable with me. You know what I'm talking about? I mean, for a while there, I was starting to feel like, back in the early 90s when I had that really long cable so I could go talk in the garage on the phone so my parents wouldn't listen in, right? You guys remember those days? But the dynamic was, it's just, no matter how much money I have, I could always use more. And I think most of us are in that situation. And so when we talk about giving money away, particularly when we talk about giving a percentage of our money away, it gets really awkward and really sticky and really difficult for us to process through. But I want us to pause for just a moment here, and I want us to think not about how we feel about our money being given away, but I want us to think about why God would ask us to tithe. Why would God even bother to ask us, instruct us, some would even say command us to tithe? And why is tithing not talked about in the New Testament? I want to kind of wrestle with a little bit of that for just a bit. You see, tithing is, in our culture, is very much associated with money and is very much associated with church life. And, well, that kind of makes sense, seeing as here in America, in the United States, the vast majority of our religious experience is Christian. And the vast majority of our religious Christian experience is in a church. But tithing has actually been a practice that has been engaged by multiple cultures over multiple different faiths and multiple different, beliefs for a really, really long time. Actually, the first time tithing comes up is found in Genesis chapter 14, and it's not even an instruction, it's not even a command. It's this sense in which this guy just kind of all of a sudden does tithe. And it's like, what's that about? Where does that come from? Flip over to Genesis chapter 14. We're going to be looking at verse 17 and following. And just look there briefly, and then we're going to flip over into Deuteronomy. And we're going to be looking at chapter 14 of Deuteronomy. So we're going to be in Genesis 14, and then a little bit later, we're going to be in Deuteronomy 14. But this first expression of tithing, this first action of tithing is found here by Abram, who was the guy called by God to move from his home and his family and his comforts to a place where God would show him. And the way that we understand it is he basically moved from, kind of the place where the Persian Gulf attaches to Iraq and Iran. He moved from that region there all the way over to what would now be kind of described as modern-day Israel. Now, just so you know, he didn't take a straight line across because it's a lot of desert in between. He had to walk up north over the mountains and back down south to get to that spot because that was the journey that he took. And that was the healthier journey. But there was a lot of different dynamics going on. But he gets into this area where there's lots of little clan leaders. Lots of guys who are kind of leading the way. And they're kind of called kings. And they are at war with each other at different times as they fight over who gets what well, and they fight over who gets what land, and they fight over who gets this spot and that spot. Because water and land mattered a lot. Land, good land, was fertile, so you could plant your crops and you could have a bigger harvest. Feed yourself and your family. You could feed your animals, your flocks and your herds. Water was extremely significant, so you fought over, those wells, those cisterns and things that had been dug out. And there was a lot of different conflict that occurred in a variety of different ways. But here in chapter 14, verse 17, Abram returned from his victory over that guy with the really long name, Chedorlaomer, and all his allies, and the king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Shavah, that is the king's valley, and Melchizedek, the king of Salem, the priest of God Most High, brought Abram some bread and wine. And Melchizedek blessed Abram with a blessing, said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has defeated your enemies for you." Then Abram gave Melchizedek a tenth of all the goods he had recovered. It's a tenth. Well, that's tithe. In case you ever wonder what tithe really means, it means a dime, a tenth. And so 1/10 of everything that he had recovered in the victory over the enemies, because that's how they worked. It wasn't just that, they went in there and they beat the bad guys and walked out and said, hey, we beat the bad guys. No, they once they beat the bad guys, they took the bad guys' stuff. And so all the goods that he had plundered and won, the spoils of victory, he gave a tenth of. And there was no instruction, no command. Melchizedek didn't look at Abram and say, "Give me your tenth." Actually, we don't even really know much about Melchizedek. He's one of the great mysteries of the Bible. It's kind of like, who is this guy? What's he all about? And there's lots of, speculation, lots of questions about who he is, and you can read more about him in the book of Hebrews. But this act that Abram engages in giving tenth, is it that he just had so much, he thought, well, I'm just going to help the poor little Melchizedek out. I'm going to give him a little bit of my goods. He doesn't have a lot. we'll share with him. I don't really think that that's what's going on. Because, he's described as a king. He's described as a guy who's kind of got it together. I don't think it's so much that, he was just like, well, I'm going to pay for my blessing now. You've blessed me, I'm going to pay for my blessing. Some faiths practice that. If you want your household blessed, then you pay a fee to the priests, and then they bless your house. And I've never had anybody offer that to me. If you're interested, I can't do anything for you there. All right? Yeah, but it's an interesting idea. It's kind of like, well, that's, here's, one of the things, I was having a conversation with somebody the other day, and I realized I'm not smart enough to be a criminal. Did you realize that most of you probably aren't smart enough to be a criminal either? In the sense that the stuff that they come up with, you never would think of. I just come to realize I'm not smart enough to be a criminal. And I'm not smart enough to figure out that if I just went around and prayed for people, that they should pay me for that. That would be awesome. But I don't really like that idea. But, it was an interesting idea. Some people see it, that that's what's taking place. But what if Abram is recognizing exactly what Melchizedek said? Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be the God Most High, who has defeated Abram's enemies for Abram. And it is an expression of thanks. What if his tithe, his giving, is an expression of, hey, God, this is yours, or you made this possible, and so I'm turning it over to you. That's an interesting idea, interesting way to think about it. As opposed to, I'm turning it over to you so that you bless me. Rather, you've already blessed me, and so this is part of the celebration. Because here's the hard part about tithing is that we think of tithing in our culture today as just purely money, and so therefore we let the money go. Flip over to Deuteronomy chapter 14. This is one of the places where Moses is recounting the instructions of God to the people of God as they're setting up their community, as they're preparing to go into the promised land. Chapter 14, verse 22, we see Moses talking about tithing here. And as I was reading this, there was something that stood out to me that was kind of interesting, and it makes it hard for us to process tithing in the same way. Because we think of tithing as in the sense of writing a check or putting cash in the offering plate. But they tithed something different. And the expression was different. So listen here. Verse 22 of chapter 14. You must set aside a tithe of your crops, 1/10 of all your crops, that you harvest each year. Bring this tithe to the designated place of worship, the place the Lord your God chose for his name to be honored, and eat it there in his presence. This applies to your tithes of grain, new wine, olive oil, firstborn males of your flocks and herds. Doing this will teach you always to fear or revere the Lord your God. Did you catch that? Like, they're giving grain and wine and animals, and not only are they giving them up to God, but they actually get to enjoy them in God's presence. They got to eat and drink their tithe with the priest and in the presence of God. That's really hard to do with cash, isn't it? And I think it's one of the things that kind of gets us hung up here in trying to understand and process through what tithing is, because the process or the mechanism of what they tithe and how they tithe is so different than what you and I do. They were agrarian in their lifestyle, many of them. Now, there were some traders. There were some who swapped goods and had some sense of, idea of currency taking place. Because check this out a little bit further. 24. Now when the Lord your God blesses you with a good harvest, the place of worship he chooses for his name to be honored might be too far for you to bring the tithe. If so, you may sell the tithe portion of your crops and herds and put the money in a pouch and go to the place the Lord has chosen. When you arrive, you may use the money to buy any kind of food you want. cattle, sheep, wine, or other alcoholic drink. Then feast there in the presence of the Lord your God, and celebrate with your household. And do not neglect the Levites in your town, for they will receive no allotment of land among you. Now, before we dive into 27, I just want to pause again here for just a moment. And I want to read that back half of 26. Then feast there in the presence of the Lord your God, and celebrate with your household. Tithing was not something that was burdensome. Tithing was something that was rejoicing. Tithing was an expression of God's goodness and generosity. And it was going to the master and sharing in the meal with the master. It was a recognition that the harvest that they had reaped, the crops, and the beauty of that, and the herd that had been born that year, all of those things they had no control over. I mean, yeah, they went out there and they made sure that the soil was tilled, and they made sure that the seed had been planted, and they did their aspect of work, but they can't determine how fast it grows. They can't determine how much of it actually takes, and they can't determine when the sheep are going to reproduce and how many are going to come in that new flock, or the same with the cows and on. So they had this great dependence upon God. Now, it says here that if they lived too far from the place of God, they would sell their stuff and put their money in a pouch and then go and buy new animals to eat and new drink to enjoy, and they celebrated the goodness of God. How many of you ever got a promotion at work? Anybody ever get a promotion at work? We got to work on this, folks. Some of you need to get a promotion, all right? Yeah. Yeah, all right. But when you get a promotion, or how many of you have ever gotten a new job? Anybody ever got a new job? Okay, all right. So when you get a new job or you get a promotion at work, typically somebody will celebrate with you. They might say, "Hey, man, let's go have a special meal." You know, food is a part of celebration, and it's a part of the, yes, what an amazing thing happened to me. I remember Christy and I, one of the earliest celebrations that we got was when we got a raise. We got a raise in our credit limit. Anybody ever do that celebration? Got a raise in your credit limit, and you're like, yeah, let's go out. So we went to Red Lobster, all right? Yeah. That was the first and last time that we celebrated the raise in a credit limit, but it was when you're young and you're dumb and you're desperate for a good meal, you're just like, yeah, baby, yeah. That's not good financial advice, but it's what we did, okay? It was a small meal. It wasn't a big, but anyway, the thing is, here's the thing. Here's what I want you to catch. Tithing off of the harvest, tithing off of the herd was a celebration, not a burden. And so when you think to the New Testament and it talks about God loves the hilarious giver, when Paul's writing there to the church in Corinth, and he says, God loves the cheerful giver. That's the tamed way of saying it, but some would argue that the translation is more appropriate, the hilarious giver, the guy who is rejoicing with great joy. And when they saw the star, I'm sorry, that's what, every time I say that phrase, all right? But there was this great enthusiasm that went with it. If you think about it from the standpoint, if you just had a huge crop, you're celebrating. If you just had any kind of crop, you're celebrating. And so tithing wasn't a burden, it was a joy. Now, we don't grow crops. Most of us don't raise livestock. And so therefore, we get off the hook, right? We don't have to worry about this whole tithing thing. Well, some people actually believe that. I don't think that's a good application. It may be literally accurate, but I don't think it's necessarily good application for how to think about it. I personally have been tithing for 24 years. And nobody told me I had to tithe. Nobody said, Malcolm, if you don't start tithing, you're not a good Christian. Nobody laid that guilt trip on me. It was just one of those things where I kind of caught it. I got a job, and I believe God is the one who's provided me the job. And the source of my income, the source of my provision for my household, I recognize is from God. Now, I didn't do that when it wasn't after I started being a pastor that I started tithing. I tithed long before I was a pastor, because I've only been a pastor for 15 years. But I had a job. I was 16, 17 years old when I got my first job working at Walmart. I wasn't a believer when I first started working at Walmart. But when I became a believer, shortly after I became a believer, I just got this idea that I should tithe. And I've never seen it as a burden. I've seen it as a sense in which, hey, this is a good thing. I've never really overly questioned where my tithe went to or how my tithe was being used. And I used the place of where I worshiped as the place to give my tithe. I know there are some who are like, man, if I gave my whole tithe to the church would have more money to know what to do with. Trust me, that's not true. Trust me, that's not true. But if you have that belief, then that's fine. Let's talk about it. The place where I worship is where I tithe. Now, in the days in which Moses is giving the instructions, the tabernacle, because Moses had the tabernacle, not the temple. The tabernacle may have been quite a ways away from where people went, but that was the place of worship. Now we've created places of worship, multiple ones on each street corner, right? And there are many different ways, but the big thing I want us to catch here is that tithing wasn't something done begrudgingly. It was done something out of an expression of the generosity of God. That God had been generous and kind to them. And so they gave back. And they celebrated with it when they gave their tithing. A few years ago, I was listening to a podcast of a guy, and they had joy boxes for their givings. And I always thought, well, that's a cute name, a joy box for a giving box. They had boxes located at the back of the sanctuary area, and at the end of each service, after I listened to him preach, he'd say, hey, this concludes us today. Hey, as you make your way out, don't forget, we've got joy boxes in the back, and everybody would shout for joy. And I thought, boy, that's a different kind of church. Because they understood that their giving and their tithing, I think it was more than just that God loves a hilarious giver. I think it went back to this principle of celebrating and feasting. And I'll be honest, one of the things we don't do well in the church is we don't do a good job of using our tithe as the fullness of our worship. I mean, we understand it keeps the lights on. We understand, it pays for staff and those sort of things. But that's different than feasting together, celebrating in the fullness of it. And one of the things that I know people struggle with is, how do you express appreciation to church volunteers? Do you buy them a meal out of the money that was tithed to the church? Is that appropriate? What do you think? Maybe. Maybe not. But we live in a culture today that's not got grain and wine and grapes and cows and sheep and goats that we bring and we feast on together. We live in a culture today that's about money. And let's be honest, we could all use a little bit more of it. We could all put more of it to use for whatever we have desire of. But what money you have, why don't you think about that God gave it to you? And finding a way to practice tithing with it, giving 10% of it back as an expression of appreciation, an expression of celebration. But money's tricky. Jesus had these words to say in Matthew chapter 6. No one can serve two masters, for you will hate one and love the other. You'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Boy, that's tough. I think one of the challenges that I face, and one of the reasons why I practice the discipline of tithing, is that there's a side of me that if I let it go unredeemed and let it go without God's intervention, I might be like Scrooge McDuck. Do you guys remember Scrooge McDuck? Like when I was a kid, there was this cartoon called DuckTales. Woo! Yeah, all right? So DuckTales was great, and Scrooge McDuck had this huge money bin full of golden coins, and he would go swimming in it. Obviously, it was fictional. I mean, you can't swim in coins, but he could. And every now and then, his nephews would get a chance to go swimming in it, but he'd go and he'd bask in it, and the thing is that he always wanted more of it, always needed more of it, and he was always interested in gathering more. And I'll be honest, if I didn't submit myself to Christ, I probably would be one of those guys. That's hard to believe. I know it's hard for my family and Christy to believe, because at the same time, right now, you see me, I'm the kind of guy who would give everything I've got away. But I look at that and I say, the reason I can approach that and give everything I've got away is because of Christ. And without Christ changing me, shaping me, transforming me, redeeming me, restoring me, then I would likely be one who just serves money. And I would watch it all disappear as I tried to gain more and more of it. And I would not find myself able to enjoy it. I would not find myself able to celebrate the goodness of it, that God had given it and passed it through me. I would find myself trying to hold on to every bit of it. And so tithing is an expression of celebration. Tithing is an expression of God's provision in your life. But tithing is also a discipline. And I think, honestly, one of the reasons why the New Testament writers don't specifically address this issue of tithing is because, and this is inference, the culture as a whole already tithed to their various places of worship. And so it just seemed natural. That's what they did when they found the one true God, as opposed to Zeus or Aphrodite or whoever it is that they chose to worship. But it's an expression of God's provision. It's an expression of gratefulness. And it's a discipline that we can engage in, so that way we don't fall prey to serving someone other than God. Because the great temptation is, I earned it. I get to keep it, right? And the thing that God wants us to understand is that He's incredibly generous. And He's given us so much more than what we need. So celebrate with Him. Celebrate with Him. So if you don't practice tithing and you want to talk some more about it, I'd be glad to chat with you some more about it. If you practice tithing and you do it begrudgingly, let me just say, put your heart before God and ask Him to transform you and challenge you on that. If you practice tithing in hopes that God will bless you back, let me just tell you, God doesn't bless you back because you tithe. God blessed you, and that's why you tithe. There's a big difference there. And so I really want you to just kind of take some time this week and wrestle through, what is tithing? What does it really entail? How is it this work? And let's talk about it some more. But let's see what our lives look like when we express completely and fully that God is our source. Let's see and experience what our lives look like when there's no doubt about it. I didn't earn this. I received this. Let's pray. God,